Abstract. This article explores the transformation of modern warfare through the lens of the Ukraine conflict, where conventional state armies increasingly operate in ways characteristic of irregular warfare. Early American intelligence forecasts predicted a prolonged, Afghan-like war, a prediction that, over time, has been structurally validated. The study shows how regular formations have evolved, or devolved, into small, autonomous, dispersed units that navigate technologically transparent battlefields dominated by precision fires and attrition. Classical operational coherence erodes, command structures hybridize, and symbolic victories gain strategic significance alongside material survival. Drawing on both classical and contemporary military theory, the article introduces the concept of irregularized regular warfare to describe this phenomenon, emphasizing that Ukraine represents a paradigmatic shift in the ontology of 21st century conflict. The study highlights implications for military doctrine, strategic planning, and the theoretical understanding of war's evolution under technological and organizational pressures. Devolutionary warfare, the odd journey of one military forecast. By OpenAI. In the first months of the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine, a number of American military and intelligence analysts warned that the conflict was likely to evolve into a drawn-out war of attrition resembling the United States' long entanglement in Afghanistan. Their reasoning, articulated in briefings circulated within the Department of Defense, the CIA and the Defense Intelligence Agency, was not merely that the Russian military would face unexpectedly firm resistance, nor that Ukraine would prove more resilient than conventional power estimations suggested. Rather, the prediction pointed to something deeper, a structural transformation of the battlefield itself. The analysts observed that a modern high-intensity conflict between industrial powers, when extended over time, erodes the conventional grammar of war and tends to mutate into a quasi-irregular form. A struggle of dispersed units, localized initiative, diffuse fronts and attritional strategies that resemble prolonged insurgencies more than classical interstate wars. At first glance, such forecasts seemed ill-fitted to the conflict. Many Western commentators expected a rapid Ukrainian collapse, others anticipated a swift Russian defeat following the first counteroffensives. Yet gradually, and almost imperceptibly, the analytical lens proposed by American intelligence agencies became increasingly prescient. The war's duration, its attritional nature, the decentralization of tactical operations and the erosion of maneuver warfare revealed that the metaphor of an Afghan-like conflict was not a rhetorical flourish but an early recognition of a deeper transformation. To understand why this forecast now appears far from erroneous, one must examine not simply the observable tactical patterns on the battlefield but the structural logic of modern war itself. This conflict, unlike Afghanistan, is not a counterinsurgency in the classical sense. Ukraine is not fighting irregular bands scattered across a mountainous periphery. Russia is not attempting to impose control over a rural society through occupation. And neither side operates from the existential asymmetry that defined insurgent state wars in the 20th century. Nevertheless, the war increasingly mirrors the phenomenology of late modern irregular conflicts. It has generated dispersed micro-theaters, localized autonomy of small units, and the radical fragmentation of operational space. It has produced a style of combat in which the paradigmatic agent is not the armored brigade or the massed mechanized battalion, but the small infantry group supported by drones, precision fires and a web of sensor and communication systems. And it has revealed that even regular armies, when subjected to persistent attrition and technological transparency, become functionally similar to irregular forces. The difference is institutional. Rather than structural, the armies remain regular on paper, but their effective mode of action is increasingly irregular in practice. Classical military theory seldom anticipated such a transformation, though the signs were visible in the late 20th century. Clausewitz, in his reflections on the levée en masse, Clausewitz recognized that the mobilization of entire societies blurred the line between regular and irregular forces. Mao Zedong and Vo Nguyen Giap treated guerrilla war as a continuum that could escalate into conventional war once mass and organization reached a threshold. Mao, Giap. Yet the inverse process, a conventional war degrading into an irregularized one, did not receive comparable analytical attention. The Afghan and Iraqi campaigns forced American strategists such as Andrew Kropinevich and David Kilcullen to articulate the characteristics of modern irregular conflicts: informational transparency, decentralized initiative, dispersed combat cells, and the primacy of human terrain over contiguous lines. Kropinevich, Kilcullen. What distinguishes Ukraine is that these features have emerged not from an insurgency but from the collision of two regular, industrial, state-backed armies. A structural convergence has occurred. The hierarchical logic of Westphalian militaries now intersects with the distributed logic of insurgent warfare, producing what can be described as a regularized regularity. This irregularization is not merely a tactical adaptation but a transformation of the fundamental ontology of the battlefield. The first driver of this shift is technological transparency. The proliferation of unmanned aerial vehicles, from high-end strategic platforms to cheap commercial quadcopters, has rendered the battlefield nearly transparent. Drone feeds, coupled with satellite imagery, radio-electronic sensors and AI-assisted targeting systems, reduce the possibilities for concealment. Large troop concentrations, mechanized assault formations and logistical convoys become visible almost immediately, and visibility translates into vulnerability. The battlefield resembles a vast panopticon in which every movement risks immediate detection and consequent annihilation by artillery, loitering munitions or long-range precision fires. In such a medium, survival depends on fragmentation. Units disperse, adopt semi-autonomous movement patterns, utilize micro-cover, and operate in small, agile teams rather than in massed formations. The logic of dispersion, inherent in guerrilla war, becomes unavoidable even for conventional forces. The second driver is the dominance of precision fires. High-precision artillery systems, rocket launchers and kamikaze drones have replaced massed formations as the primary instruments of attrition. War becomes a duel of remote-delivered force. The contact line persists physically, but the decisive exchanges occur at a distance. The effect approximates the logic of counterinsurgency environments, where the enemy is targeted not through large engagements but through a constant hunt for small, fleeting signatures. The Ukrainian and Russian militaries increasingly allocate resources to such signatures: a cluster of soldiers, a vehicle under a tree line, a team preparing an improvised launch platform. This transition de-emphasizes classical maneuver and reinforces a quasi-partisan style of conflict. The irregular idiom dominates not because the armies wish to fight irregularly, but because any other form of combat invites destruction. The third driver is logistical strain. Modern mechanized warfare consumes prodigious quantities of ammunition, fuel and spare parts. Yet as lines of supply become degraded and infrastructure is destroyed, the ability to maintain large, continuous operations diminishes. Units inevitably become more autonomous. They improvise local supply channels, repurpose civilian vehicles, and adapt commercial technologies. This improvisational ethos is structurally identical to guerrilla warfare, where self-sufficiency, technological bricolage and adaptive tactics compensate for logistical limitations. The Ukrainian practice of rapidly integrating civilian drones into reconnaissance and strike roles, or the Russian practice of modifying commercial vehicles into improvised fighting platforms, exemplifies this convergence. The industrial scale remains national, but the tactical scale resembles insurgency. Thus the Afghan analogy, initially interpreted as a reference to duration alone, points instead to an emerging configuration of war in which regular and irregular modalities converge. Afghanistan taught American analysts that dominant military powers can lose the operational initiative in a war of endurance, not because the adversary is superior but because the battlefield favors the small, the dispersed and the adaptive. In Ukraine, neither side is inherently weak, yet both are caught in a structural trap similar to that of Afghanistan. The battlefield rewards the irregular and punishes the regular. The difference is that in Ukraine, both sides are regular armies. Thus the irregularization operates symmetrically. The war resembles not a state against insurgents but insurgency against insurgency conducted with industrial weapons. One of the most significant consequences of this transformation is the dissolution of the classical front. The front line persists geographically but loses conceptual coherence. In a regular war, the front demarcates zones of control, defining operational depth and strategic maneuver. In an irregularized conflict, the front becomes porous, contested at innumerable micro-points rather than shifted by large operational movements. Small infiltration teams, reconnaissance strike cells, sapper units and drone operators engage in constant micro-battles that shape the tactical reality more decisively than brigade-level maneuvers. The war becomes granular. Its texture is that of a mosaic rather than a line. Units operate not as segments of a larger formation but as nodal points in a distributed network. The front is no longer a barrier but a membrane through which small units pass, strike, withdraw and reposition with relative fluidity. This distributed logic also alters the nature of command and control. Classical operational art presupposes a hierarchical structure in which orders flow downward and information flows upward. But in an environment where the tempo of micro-engagements is extremely high, and where survival depends on instant adaptation, rigid hierarchy becomes a liability. Both the Ukrainian and Russian militaries have thus adopted increasingly decentralized forms of command. Ukrainian forces, traditionally more flexible, integrated decentralized mission command early in the war. Russian forces, historically more hierarchical, adapted more slowly but eventually moved towards similar autonomy at the small unit level. In both cases, the shift resembles the distributed leadership of guerrilla cells, where local operators exercise judgment based on immediate conditions. The result is a hybrid command structure combining hierarchical strategic visions with decentralized tactical execution. Such hybridity undermines the classical distinction between regular and irregular forces at the level of praxis. Another structural transformation lies in the shifting relationship between the struggles for existence and prestige. In classical interstate war, the struggle for existence, the survival of the polity, dominates strategic thinking, while prestige, honor and symbolic recognition play supportive roles. But in a war of attrition where decisive victory is elusive and where political objectives become increasingly ambiguous over time, the struggle for prestige acquires disproportionate weight. Both sides seek symbolic victories, local advances, the destruction of enemy materiel, or the capture of strategically marginal settlements because these achievements sustain morale, domestic legitimacy and international support. Prestige becomes an operational objective, not a byproduct. This mirrors the logic observed in irregular wars, where insurgent groups often prioritize symbolic acts to demonstrate resilience, maintain cohesion and shape external perceptions. The war in Ukraine has adopted similar symbolic metrics: the destruction of a high-value target, the downing of a particular aircraft, or the capture of a village becomes a symbolic currency in the absence of decisive breakthroughs. Such symbolic victories do not alter the strategic balance but maintain the subjective sense of momentum. The war thus becomes not only a material struggle but a struggle of narratives, reputations, and psychological dominance. Equally important is the degradation of the division of labor within the military system. In high-intensity regular wars, the division of labor is refined. Reconnaissance, engineering, logistics, infantry, armor, artillery, and aviation operate as specialized components of a coherent whole. But in an irregularized environment, specialization loses its coherence because units must adapt to rapidly changing tasks. Infantry groups conduct drone reconnaissance. Artillerymen act as forward observers. Tank crews operate dismounted. Engineers participate directly in assaults. This collapse of specialization reflects both necessity and structural pressure. When the battlefield is transparent, the time between detection and strike is compressed, and the stability of positions is minimal. Specialization becomes less functional than adaptability. The soldier becomes a polyvalent agent. This polyvalence is analogous to the guerrilla fighter, whose roles are fluid and whose survival depends on versatility. Thus the division of labor decays not because militaries desire it but because the battlefield demands it. The result is a hybrid soldier who embodies both regular and irregular attributes. The weakening of specialization also affects the middle tiers of military organization, the officers, NCOs, and technical specialists who normally form the backbone of regular armies. As casualties mount and experienced cadres are depleted, these intermediate layers lose coherence. Amateurism partially replaces professionalism, and the line between military and civilian capabilities blurs as civilian technologies, civilian volunteers, and civilian expertise become integrated into the war effort. This phenomenon was observed in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and other irregular conflicts, where state forces depended heavily on paramilitary groups, contractors, or volunteers. In Ukraine, the same logic manifests differently, but the structural resemblance is clear. The war absorbs society into itself, eroding the boundary between military and civilian spheres. This blurring accelerates the irregularization of the conflict and further destabilizes the classical model of regular war. The transformation described above does not imply that the war has become identical to an insurgency. Rather, it reveals that the categories of regular and irregular war are losing explanatory power. The war in Ukraine is not hybrid in the conventional sense of combining conventional and unconventional methods. It is hybrid in a deeper sense. The fundamental grammar of regular war has been altered by technological, logistical, and organizational pressures to such a degree that the war's ontology resembles a structurally irregular conflict conducted by regular militaries. This hybrid ontology reshapes the political dimensions of the war as well. A long war fought by irregularized regular forces limits the prospects for decisive outcomes. Strategic victories become improbable. Instead, the war tends to stabilize into a persistent equilibrium of attrition. This equilibrium resembles the frozen conflicts and endless insurgencies of the late 20th century more than the decisive interstate wars of the mid-20th. The Afghan analogy, therefore, is not about terrain, actors, or ideology but about the structural logic of endurance, fragmentation, and the erosion of classical military forms. One might argue that technological superiority, increased industrial output, or new operational concepts could reverse this irregularization and restore classical maneuver warfare. However, the deeper logic of technological transparency suggests otherwise. As long as cheap drones, sensors, and precision munitions saturate the battlefield, concentration of force remains suicidal. Even large mechanized breakthroughs, should they occur, would likely be localized and unsustainable. Operational surprise becomes nearly impossible under conditions of real-time surveillance. Maneuver becomes constrained by drone-observed corridors, pre-registered artillery zones, and omnipresent loitering munitions. The battlefield becomes an algorithmic environment in which sensor networks shape maneuver more than human decision. In such a medium, irregularized behavior is not a tactical choice but a structural necessity. The future of war may thus resemble not the mechanized blitzkrieg of 1940 or the deep operations of the Soviet 1944 campaigns, but the distributed, sensor-driven, attritional micro-conflicts emerging in Ukraine. The war becomes a contest of adaptive micro-units supported by industrial-scale technological systems. The paradox is that industrial war resurrects the phenomenology of guerrilla war, though at a far higher technological level. This raises a deeper theoretical question concerning the nature of modern political violence. The Ukrainian war suggests that the distinction between the struggle for existence and the struggle for prestige, central to socio-political theory from Hegel to Koyave, is being reconfigured under the pressures of technological warfare. In a long, attritional conflict without decisive outcomes, the struggle for existence becomes perpetual, while the struggle for prestige becomes episodic but symbolically potent. Small victories acquire exaggerated narrative value. The politics of war thus shifts from decisive battles to sustained symbolic performances, mediated through information systems, media networks and international perceptions. In this sense, irregularized regular warfare converges with the informational logic of late modern societies, in which legitimacy is continuously produced through symbolic exchanges. The battlefield becomes a medium of political communication as much as a physical arena of destruction. The irregularization of war thus parallels the irregularization of politics. One may conclude, therefore, that the war in Ukraine represents not only a geopolitical conflict but an inflection point in the evolution of warfare itself. It reveals that modern war, when extended in time and saturated by technology, tends toward fragmentation, irregularization and symbolic contestation. The early American forecast that the war would resemble Afghanistan was not a superficial analogy but an early recognition of this structural trajectory. The war has not become Afghanistan in its empirical details, but it has reproduced the deeper logic of protracted, irregularized conflict. The paradox of this transformation is that it arises not from asymmetry but from symmetry. Two industrial, state-backed armies fighting under conditions that systematically erode the viability of regular war. The future of interstate conflict may thus lie less in decisive maneuver and more in the irregularized, attritional, symbolic and distributed patterns now visible in Ukraine. The war, as it unfolds, foreshadows a broader transformation in the ontology of war itself, one that our existing conceptual categories struggle to capture. Yet one that increasingly defines the real conditions of contemporary conflict.